Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, comrades and friends, I'm going to be your professor, Ian Phillips, and this is for the class Education 101. This is the fourth lecture in the series on data-driven instruction, assessment, and grading. And so before we begin here, I just want to say timestamps will be in the description below if you want to skip ahead to this wonderful topic today. If not, you can sit back, listen, kick your feet up, eat some popcorn, and listen to what we talked about last week for a quick review. So last week we talked about behavior management, and we really talked about everything to do with behavior. You know, where does it come from? Why is it important to effectively manage it, and how you can do so. And we worked through some case studies, and so I gave you a scenario, and you had to figure out, well, how am I going to react to this disciplinary issue or this infraction? And so that could be a number of different things. One of the funny ones we talked about was kids. This didn't happen in my class. It happened in another person's class that I know of. They took a bunch of carrots. They smuggled them on into their pockets, and then they dropped them on the floor, right? And then they just smeared them all into the floor and whatnot. It's like, how do you even react to something like that, right? Like, it's just so out of the realm of anything I'm even considering as a potential possibility for a disciplinary infraction, yet it does happen. And so you have to be ready for things like that and just know how to respond. Right? You're going to get asked questions in an interview if you're being asked if you're being asked questions by anybody who knows their worth or is worth anything, right? As an administrator, they're going to ask you. It's like, okay, you got this situation here. How do you handle it? Or they'll say something along the lines of, what is your strategy? Right? And how are you effectively dealing with discipline in the classroom, right? So either one of those two questions, are they going to give you either a specific scenario, you got to know how to react to it, or they're going to ask you straight up, what is your plan, right? And like, how do you generally handle things, and what is your philosophy, and so on. They're going to be asking you those two questions, and that's how you know they're a good administrator, first of all, because those are vital questions, and it's much more vital than you might think now as somebody who hasn't necessarily been into the classroom before. Or maybe you haven't into the classroom before because you are a full-time teacher, and you're just looking to make your life a lot easier by using some of the different tactics talked about in this class. And so there's a number of different things to take into consideration for discipline, but probably the most important thing is that it's very controversial. And you have to be able to sort of navigate this landscape where people have their own opinions, right? And people, they'll hold grudges against you, right? Like, if you don't react a certain way to a disciplinary infraction based on their ideology that they're trying to impress upon you, well, you're not going to get along with that person. And so you have to be able to accept that, not everybody's going to agree with you and your practices, right? But you have to do what works for your classroom, and there's no one right or wrong answer to every single scenario. There are different approaches to things depending on how lenient you want to be, and in your relationships with the students, and the policies that you have at your own given school, and your own personality for that matter as well. And so, these things are complicated. They're very complex with behavior management, and you have to be willing to accept that things are just going to happen, right? You can't make everything you just go away, right? The snap of fingers. Just because you think you're a good teacher, right? You can't just make behavior problems go away, right? There was in the Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov, he says, he's writing this story here, and there's this monk, right? And it's like the main character of the story. His name's Alyosha. And Alyosha is this saint-like figure, right? He almost does no wrong, and everybody loves him, right? They love him throughout the community, this little town. And one day he's caught up in all this drama and this trouble, right? And one day he's walking into town, and he sees these boys who are throwing rocks at this one kid or whatever, right? And he's like, what in the world, right? So he goes up to try to help the kid. And what does the kid do? He was trying to be helped by Alyosha. He takes rocks himself and throws them at Alyosha, and I believe he bites his hand. And so he wasn't friendly at all. And you're thinking, you just extended your friendship to a person, right, who's in need, who's in trouble, and you're trying to better their situation, right? You're trying to make it so that way they're not getting bullied or harassed by the other children, and they come back to bite you. And I just think it's a funny, not a funny story. I mean, it's a sad story, but it's a it's a story it's almost like an allegory in some regards, right? It's very relevant to today's situation where sometimes kids just don't know how to respond to I guess people being nice to them, right? I mean, they never had anybody be nice to them. And so one of the things that I talked about in the last lecture here, I don't have it on the board right now, was the parental situation, right, or underprivileged backgrounds, right? So if you got parents who are very mean to your kid, for example, right? Maybe they just don't know how to respond to niceness, and so that's a possibility. Or maybe they're being bullied. They think everybody's out to get them in some regards, right? And it's a defense mechanism, right? Because if everybody is out to get them, right, in the majority of the time in their life, right, well, of course they're going to put up their guard whenever you come around and try to be friendly to them, right? And maybe they do come around eventually, right? But you're going to deal with a lot of kids who, well, it's going to be difficult, right? And they don't know how necessarily to respond to certain things. And so you got to be willing to accept that it's just a very difficult profession in general, right? And you can't necessarily always make the best outcomes happen, right? And so, well, that's behavior management. And so the last lecture was pretty interesting. I do recommend watching it if you're struggling with behavior, or if I think it's probably going to be one of the most important lectures of the series, right? And so I'm really trying to keep everything very rigid in terms of what we're covering here. I don't really want to stray into too random of topics, right? I want to make sure that you guys are getting the most crucial elements of education, right, underneath your belt, so that way when you go into interviews, right, you are the most prepared candidate you possibly can be, and the best practitioner for that matter too. Because it's not necessarily just about getting the job, it's about actually doing good at your job, right, and actually making a difference, right? And so, one of the ways that you do that here, and so we're breaking on into our lecture for today, is data-driven instruction, assessment, and grading. So data-driven instruction, what is it? Is it a practice that you should be using often? What differentiates data-driven instruction from regular instruction? Why is it important to know what assessment is, right? Why is it important to even talk about grading? Don't you just grade the paper if they're right or wrong and that's it? Well, we're going to delve on into these things and we're just sort of exploring these topics really. I'm just trying to give you my thoughts and my thought process behind things, and just give you some of my visceral reactions when I'm working through these issues. And so, data-driven instruction. I guess we'll start with the definition of what it actually is, right? And so, obviously, people will argue about definitions and whatnot, and everybody sort of does have their own definition in some regards. But I feel like a solid definition that I just came up with here was the act of using data to inform instructional decisions. Very straightforward, right? Data-driven instruction, right? You're using data to inform your instructional decisions, right? Like, it's not that difficult to memorize, right? And so you're using data, right? Well, how do you get this data, right? And why should you use it at all? And how can you use it most effectively is what we're going to talk about today. And so, we'll break on in with a memorable quote here that you see on the board here. It says, teaching without consideration for data is akin to driving a car across the country without a roadmap. And you should not expect to effectively reach your destination without its input. Right? And so I remember when I was a graduate student doing my master's degree, and I'm still a graduate student, right? I'm doing my doctorate right now. I'm about 60% of the way done, whoop whoop. And so on my way to doctoral candidacy. But one of the things that you'll find right away is that, you'll find right away in graduate school is it's a lot more quantitative than undergraduate, right? Undergraduate work, right? And they want you to relate all of your work back to evidence-based practices, which are oftentimes just rooted in data in general. And I remember it was one of my first classes. They gave this analogy, and so I'm not sure where it's from. I tried looking it up. I couldn't find a person to quote it for, so I just made my own quote of this little story here, this little saying. And it's like, look, you want to get to California and you're in Maine. It's like, all right, maybe you can get there, right? But it's going to be difficult for you to get there. You're not going to get there in the most efficient manner, or most effectively. If you do end up getting there at all, and you might not be able to pinpoint the exact location, right? Because you don't have a map, right? You don't know the entire landscape, right? Just like you don't know all of your students perfectly in depth, right? And so if you're not analyzing the data and assessing it, just like you would assess a roadmap, right? And the roadmap is just a collection of data, positioned into these images where you can sort of navigate them, right? Data is no different. You can navigate this data, and eventually you can come to certain understandings about your students and certain best practices that you want to implement into your classroom. And so, very memorable quote there. I just wanted to open up with that. I don't know, it's just a quote that really hit me, when I was a young master's student. So this was the very start of my master's degree. And, I figured I'd leave you guys with it. So anyways, we'll break on into step one here. So we're talking about data collection. How is it achieved? And we'll work on formative assessment, give some examples, summative assessment, and then we'll get into step two. So it's like, so once you gather the data, what now, right? And so, and then we'll talk about performance index scores, effective grading, and the like. So anyways here, let me get a quick drink here. All right, so step one, right? Data collection, right? How is it achieved, right? Well, it begins with assessment. And so assessment. You're going to hear that word all the time, right? And sometimes I like to think to myself, why is everybody harping on this stuff? It's such a crucial topic in education. But if you really think about assessment, like everything that you're doing, you're assessing in some regards, right? Whenever you're working with students, you're assessing them, right? Kind of like the word differentiation, right? Where it means so much that it means nothing. Assessment's kind of the same thing, right? Everything that you do, you're essentially gathering data, right? Even if you're just looking at a student, right, and how they're behaving or performing, or in any regards, you're always assessing the classroom constantly, even if you're not necessarily getting as much data back. You're always assessing the classroom. And so, let's say you're even sitting there with a documentary, right? And you're just sitting back at your desk and everybody's watching the documentary. It's like you're still assessing the classroom for behavior, right? Because if there's any behavioral infractions, well, then you have to jump on it, right? You're still assessing the classroom to make sure kids aren't just passed out, right, drooling on their desk because they're sleeping, right? And so, you're always assessing things constantly, and that feedback is continual, right? And so, look, you don't see any kids sleeping, it's like that's a continual feedback, right? But the second you see some kid sleeping, it's like, well, now you just got some more important feedback you can actually react to, right? So it's not necessarily that you're not always getting feedback, because you are always getting feedback on your end, right? But you might not always react to that, right? And so, that's assessment there. And so there's going to be two forms called formative and summative assessment. And now here's the thing. You guys must understand the difference, right? It's not optional, right? It's not something that you can just say, well, I don't want to understand formative and summative assessment. I know what assessment is, right? And so what does it matter what the specific name is? Well, it does, right? Because people use these terms all the time, right? And you can't go on in your studies without knowing what formative and summative assessment are. And you can't so there's that, right? But also, too, when you're in the field, people still bring up these terms, right? Now, I find sometimes that the older teachers don't necessarily always get some of these terms, right? And so, you can skate by without knowing the necessary terms, right? But as a young teacher, it's like you have no choice, right? You have to know what these terms mean, because people are going to ask you about them. Like, how do you formatively assess your students, right? And so if you just start talking about summative assessment instead of formative assessment when they ask you, how do you formatively assess your students, well, then you're going to have a bad time, right? People aren't going to take you seriously because you don't know what you're talking about. And so, formative assessment versus summative assessment, we can break right on into it here. What is formative assessment, right? When I think of formative assessment, it's the act of gathering data through either informal or formal means in order to guide instruction. So again, you're always using your assessment, right, the data that you get from that assessment to guide your instruction, right? But formative, it's very informal in most cases, right? Now, it doesn't have to necessarily be informal, right? It could be a worksheet or whatever, and we'll go through some examples here. But oftentimes, almost anything that you do in the hopes of altering your instruction at any given moment is formative assessment, right? So you're constantly monitoring, right? You're allowing, and it's going to allow teachers to pivot their instruction immediately. That's the distinction between formative and summative assessment is, it's occurring during instruction. It's occurring in the moment, right? It's not occurring after the fact, right? It's not like you give out a test, right? Then you sit back for the next couple of days, you analyze the data, right? And then you come back to your students and say, we should recover this. It's like, no. Formative assessment is more like, hey, let me get a show of hands who understands this concept. Or, hey, look, I was walking around, not everybody's really understanding their writing prompt today. I'm going to come around, I'm going to explain something real quick on the board and you guys get back to it, right? That's formative assessment. It's happening in the moment at that same time that you're getting that feedback on your end, right, you're trying to alter your instruction accordingly. And so formative assessment here, occurring in the moment. And so what are some examples of formative assessment? Well, you're going to have a show of hands, right? You're going to have a pop quiz, right? So something, quick, small, right? A pop quiz isn't like a full-on test, right? It's just sort of to gauge their understanding, maybe for a particular lesson or two, right? A worksheet is a very good one. That's usually tied to a single lesson or a couple. Notes, you'll have, look, if people aren't taking their notes, that's a formative assessment. Look, you got to get on them now. You're getting that feedback. You're assessing the class. Nobody's paying attention. Well, you got to get on them for it so they do pay attention. They're taking their notes, and that way they can study them later on, and they can get a good grade. Observations, right? So you're constantly looking at your students all the time. That, again, goes in with the notes there, so it's a little bit overarching. Some of these are overlapping, too, by the way, so it might seem as if they are sort of irrelevant to talk about, but there's overlap. I'm just giving you some specific examples. Questions, right? So you ask the class, it's like, hey, guys, when was the country founded, right? Just yell out the answer, right? Now, if most kids yell out 1685, right, and we're in the United States, by the way, if most kids yell out 1685, well, then nobody understands, right? So there's that. Or you could do a question on the board, where you can say, all right, everybody get out a sheet of paper, or I'm going to pass a piece of paper out to you, and we're going to assess this prompt on the board here. And you're going to walk around, you're going to observe, right? It goes back to the observations again. And if everybody's answering it wrong, then you probably got to go back and teach that again, right? And when you're recovering things in class or just going over the answers to things, it's like that's kind of what you're doing in some regards. So you might do that more often than not, or maybe just every time, right? Because there are going to be kids who you're not going to get the right answer regardless, right? And so, well, there's that. Exit tickets are a great thing, right? Again, it goes back with the questions. Reflections. Reflections are huge. When I think of reflections, right, it's really just to help you set a goal for the future, right? So you're reflecting on your performance, right? And you're trying to set a path forward so that way you're better off in the future, right? You're not just as worse off as when you came in, right? You're better. And so reflections, like if kids aren't reflecting on something, right, you gotta get on them for it, right? And that's a crucial theme that I feel like most teachers leave that out. That could be a whole lecture in itself in some regards, but we can quickly cover it. So participation. So if most kids aren't participating, well, it means that they probably don't understand, right? Now you could say, well, maybe they don't want to participate because they don't understand anything, or they're just not engaged in general. And it's like, yeah, maybe that's the case, right? But still, in terms of your baseline engagement, right? And if kids aren't meeting that baseline, whatever that average baseline is, and again, you're gonna have to come to these determinations via data collection and assessment, then you got a problem there. They're probably not understanding that much, or something's going on with some of the kids who always participate. And that's important to know, because if you know that, then you can try to help them work through their issues. And then we got project, right? So if you have a project, everybody's not doing well on it, right? Then you can, you're formatively assessing that as you walk around and help them through that project, right? Because you're going to be walking around the whole time you do a project, not just sitting at your desk, right? With your feet up, you're actually doing work, right? That's what you're there for. And so, project. All right, so those are some examples of formative assessment. Again, informal, right? You really you think about it as pivoting your instruction immediately. That's the whole purpose behind formative assessment. Now, what is its counterpart? Summative assessment, which is the act of gathering data through formal means, most often at the end of a unit or objective, right? And so it's going to occur after the fact, right? After instruction is when this is occurring. And it does not allow teachers to immediately pivot instruction, right? So oftentimes this could be like well, we got a bunch of examples here. So a final product, right? Unit test, final exams, midterms, objective tests, culminating projects, right? Something that's very inclusive of like the entire unit, the entire standard, the entire objective, right? And it's oftentimes very formal, right? And so you're going to have a rubric, right? You're going to have just a test in general, right? It's a standard traditional type test, right? Multiple choice, extended response. And then you're going to grade them on that, and you're going to get some good data in terms of, what is their performance on these tests, right? Are they, why was the class average a 73%, right? Do you need to go back and teach that, or is your class average always at 73%? And therefore, you shouldn't expect much higher, right? Because, there are baselines at different schools, right? It's like you go to the best school in your state. This is what's funny, right? Because everybody will say like, well, everybody can get an A. And you know, if they're not meeting that A, right, they're not all performing at the highest level, it's like, well, then you're doing something wrong as a teacher. It's like, that's not true, right? It's like, I could not teach at all and go to the best school in the, like I could just literally sit at my desk. I would never even speak to the students, ever, if I was at the best school in my state, and the kids would still score higher than some of the schools that are on the lower ends of the distribution, right? And so, look, I mean, the teacher, they play a role as a facilitator and a guide, right? But we can't do everything, okay? Like the kids have to put forth some effort, right? And that's going to be one of the, again, the big distinctions in terms of, you know, in terms of teacher belief. You know, some teachers are going to believe that, you know, anybody can do anything, and well, there's that, right? Anybody can do anything, right? And if you just train people, then they can, you know, come up and get good grades. They can get good jobs. They can have a nice future. And it's like, that's true to some degree, right? But you can't always take everybody, right, and make them these Harvard graduates, right? Like there's going to be, you know, there's going to be a lot of people that's just not going to be the case for, right? And you know, maybe that's a product of their environment, right? Some of these other factors, right? And maybe it's not, but you got to, you know, you got to think about these things, right? And so it's because, you know, it's probably a mix, right? Just generally with anything, right, of a bunch of different factors, right? But, you know, let's take environmental, right? It's like, look, you're born into a poor background, underprivileged, right? You have a number of different obstacles that you got to overcome, right? It's like, look, dude, you're going to probably do worse, right? And it's like you should, you know, as a teacher, it's like you can't change everything, right? You can't buy these kids houses and make sure they eat every single night and make sure that their parents are loving and friendly and help them out with their homework and tutor them and give them the proper clothes and give them the proper rewards and positive incentives. It's like you can't do everything, right? And so stop thinking that you can, because you cannot do it. You're going to eat yourself alive if you do. And so, these summative assessments here, there is baselines for these, right? You have to understand that you know, if your class average is like the best that they're probably going to get, and you can oftentimes assess these by comparing them to state testing metrics. Look, if they're performing around the state testing metric, or maybe even a little higher, you probably want to shoot for, then look, you're probably maxing out, right? But if it's really below, or if it's at the testing metric, it's like, well, then you probably need to reevaluate yourself. And you know, you can always be better, right? But how much better is the question, right? So if you do everything right in a very rough school, and I mean everything, you take every single practice into consideration, you're spending 16 hours a day working constantly, trying to benefit your students, it's like, yeah, you're going to see a big increase in performance, but you know, but eventually it's going to level off. But and so it will level off, and then you're going to have the kids in these upper echelon districts, right? The upper echelons, right? They're going to be even higher, right? And so you just have to take that into consideration, right? You know, what's one score for another teacher is different than another score for another teacher at a different location, right? And so you have to be remembering this, right? Because you're going to eat yourself alive if you don't. And so, well, summative assessment examples. Again, pretty overlapping here, but just think like finals, right? Whatever those finals may be. Could even be an essay, right? And so just something where they're summarizing up their knowledge, right? It's a summative assessment. It's all-encompassing. So yeah. So step 2. So you've gathered the data, but what now? What now, right? You've gathered the data. What now? What are you going to do with it? All right? So you're going to use it to guide your instruction, right? If students are not meeting a specified goal, then the content should be retaught in a different manner or clarified. And so, look, everybody fails your test, right? Go back, right? And you're going to want to reteach that content, or you provide some clarification, right? And then maybe test them again, right? Because you don't want your entire class to fail. You know, they can, right? And so, look, that could be your own unique grading style. Look, they didn't study enough the first time, right? Because they could study on their own accords if you make decent notes, right? But hey, maybe you didn't, right? Maybe you take some blame, right? So you gotta be willing to improve yourself in this regards, right? And be self-reflective on your end. So don't just expect it of your students and then never try to improve on your end, because it's like, well, it's the student's fault, blah, 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 blah. It's like, yeah, sometimes it is, and they definitely have some responsibility to share in the matter. And I think that they have the majority of the responsibility, in my opinion, because, well, they are the main stakeholder in their own education, right? Look, it's their education, right? They have to do the work, right? If they don't do the work, I can't force them to do the work, right? But in the same breath, I'm also the guide. I'm their instructor, right? I'm the person who's supposed to be there to help them out and navigate through this process of learning. And so, and facilitate it. And so, you know, you got to have some responsibility on your end. And if you don't have responsibility, then you shouldn't expect to get the results that you desire. And maybe you don't desire the best results, right? But then you're probably in the wrong profession because you do want the kids to perform the best, right? So in my school, I got the, look, I reflected on what I did wrong the first year, right? And you do better the next year, right? And so if you do something wrong the first year, you go back and you change it, right? You try to be better. And maybe, you know, your plan for being better doesn't always work out, right? But it's something you have to try, right? You can't just sit back and let it eat you alive, right? You got to actually fight for these things, right? You got to fight for improvement, right? It doesn't just come easy at the snap of fingers because everybody would do it then. You got to actually want it. You got to want to make that difference. You got to want to be reflective. And over time, these acts of just constantly failing and you know, not necessarily seeing the results that you want will result in resilience, right? And you eventually will come to find the best methods for things. And those methods, if they're difficult, eventually over time they'll just become habit and they'll become habitual, and you can just sort of cruise by doing them. And so you know, you then make fine tweaks and little adjustments to things as you go by. So like in my practice, you know, my first year I took my teaching extremely seriously in terms of like my testing metrics, right? And I predicted my state test score perfectly. I was teaching 8th grade science at the time. And, you know, I looked at that data, right? And I was like, well, what practices do I think work the best, right? And what practices do kids enjoy the most, right? Because if they're engaged, oftentimes then they're more motivated to perform higher in your class. And so one of the things that I did was really evaluate that. I took the best practices and then I just amplified them, right? So I just took what I thought students liked and they responded best to, and I just amplified it a bunch, right? And my scores improved even more, right? So they went up by 15 performance index points the second year, right? And so, like, look, you always got to be evaluating your practice, right? You always got to recognize that it will be a little bit more difficult to teach things the first time around, and you're not always going to see the results immediately for trying a new practice, right? You got to get familiarized with it and know what works and doesn't work, and that's going to be different. It's going to be contingent upon your own student population that you have, right? And so again, what works for one group might not work for another group, right? You know, some groups need to be disciplined a lot more harsher, and you got to be more micromanaging, right? Whereas others, we sort of leave them to their own accord, right? So you take a very high-performing school, again, they're just sort of going to do anything, right? They're just going to, I think there's this funny show, actually, right? And I think this sort of proves my point. And this is accurate, right? So if you think that this isn't an accurate TV show, well, I haven't watched the TV show, but I've seen clips of the TV show. And so, you know, it's accurate in this regard anyways. It's this show, I think it's called AP Bio. I think that's the name of the show. I could be wrong on that, right? But it's basically, it's this teacher who was a Harvard philosophy professor or something, and he somehow loses his job, I think. And as a result of losing his job, he goes to this high school, and he's teaching this AP biology class, right? And now this guy doesn't want to teach, right? He just sits back, and he just, his goal, he's telling the kids, he's like, sure, I'm not doing anything. He's like, do what you want, right? He's like, and then he has the kids like solve his problems for him, I believe. And so, well, there's that. So they're just sort of working on his behalf for his own issues. And so, anyways, in this class, though, these kids, they're all like excited to learn. They want to learn all the time, but the teacher just won't do anything, right? And so then you got some of these kids, it's like, look, they're extremely motivated. They don't even need the teacher there. And some of these kids are just going to study on their own accord, right? Because they just want to be successful so badly that they will do anything. They don't even need the teacher, right? And then you got, you know, other, environments, right? And I feel like, I can't remember the movie, right? But there was this one movie where there was this teacher. He goes into this poor urban inner city school or whatever, and he has these like unique teaching methods. And even when he's sick, right, he still comes on into work or whatever. And he's recording lectures for them on their like a VHS, I believe. And so he's going like above and beyond, right, for these kids. And you know, in the movie, right, they get the highest score in the state, right? You know, but but in like most situations, right, or I'd imagine every situation, that's just not going to happen, right? It's even if you're trying your best, like maybe doesn't do it doesn't quite reach the echelons that you want it to reach in terms of performance. And so, well, you're going to use your data to guide your instruction, right? So it should be retaught, right? And these goals are different, right? And so that's a little tangent there. But we'll get to it. So hopefully you enjoyed that little story here. Again, things are different for different groups. You gotta remember that. But it's not necessarily to say that you shouldn't be trying your best. And you know, take the specifics, specific data indicators of your own target group, and use those to your advantage, right? Like if you know kids need more support in terms of behavior, it's like then you gotta provide them more structure, make sure things are more rigid. Transitions have to be more fluid. You gotta have a strategic seating chart, right? Rules, expectations, positive incentives, negative incentives, right? And maybe another school doesn't need that, right? And it would be nice if they did have it, yes, but maybe they don't need it to get the same results that the other school does. And so do take your population into consideration, but you're only going to know that with data, right? Most of the time it's going to be formative, but you can also look at summative data as well. All right, so you're guiding your instruction, and what kind of tools can you use? Well, Excel is a valuable tool, right? And I know some of you guys, you're like, oh God, I got to use Excel, right? And it's really not that bad, actually, right? It's actually pretty easy to use. And I've always hated Excel, just because I never knew how to use it. But then as soon as I figured out how to use it, you realize right away, it's like, that's a weapon, man. It's like you can do so much with Excel. It's like you're just a different person, right? You can make graphs easily. You can calculate data like that, right, in 0.2 of a second. And if you just know how to look up how to do these things, it becomes a whole lot easier. And so even if you don't necessarily know it off the top of your head, or you got to refer back to something, it's like, you know, it just makes life so much easier using Excel. And so anyways, a valuable tool for such endeavors, analyzing this data. And so one thing that you could consider doing on Excel, well, really any software, I guess, or just even by hand if you want to, is calculated performance index score. PI score is what they call it. And this PI score, when I was at a charter school, one of the things that the regional vice president really focused on was these PI scores. And teachers had to calculate them for classes that had state testing. And so if you didn't have state testing, you didn't have to do it. But if you had state testing, you did have to calculate these PI scores. And there was a whole software setup, or a whole software inside of Excel. Right? It's like a whole program inside Excel. Excel was programmed to spit out these PI scores based on how kids were scoring on 4 multiple choice questions and 2 extended response questions. And well, these PI scores are extremely useful for predicting the outcomes of your state test, right? And so in each state, there's going to be different levels of achievement. Now, most of the time, the different levels of achievement are the following here. And so you can see down below, we have untested, limited, basic, proficient, accomplished, advanced, advanced plus, and well, there's that. And so how do you calculate a PI score then? Well, you take the percentage of your students, right, who scored in a certain range, achievement level range, right, and then you times that by the number of points that are awarded for that achievement level range. And then you add up each level, right, the amount of points that you got on each level, and that's your performance index score, right? So let me just give you an example here, right? So let's say that you got proficient, right? So let's say that the kids scored proficient, and so maybe like, I don't know, 70% correct, right, and around there, correct on their state test, right? And so 28.6% got about 70% correct, right? They're proficient in the topic, right? They know what they're talking about. They're proficient enough, right? They understand the basic competencies and the like. So they're proficient, right? 28.6% of them, right? Well, how many points are awarded for proficient level? Only 1 point, right? Because that's where you should be, right? This is like the target goal right here. 1.0, right? That's your target. Anything above that is like you're doing amazing. Anything below that is you need to pick it up, right? And so 28.6 times 1 is equal to 28.6 PI points, right? That's how many performance index points you're going to have, right? And then you do that for the other levels, right? So how many kids got basic, right? 23%. 23% times 0.6, which is how many points are awarded for that level, so that's the multiplier, right? Times that by 23, and you get 13.8, right? And so then you do that for every level and you just add them up, right? So 0.3 plus 9.6 plus 15.2 plus 28.6 plus 13.8 plus 6.6, right? And then plus 0.0 because that would be untested, right? So ideally you want to have every single kid test because it really hurts you if you don't have a kid test, right? They just automatically get a 0. And so this is for Ohio, right? And every state might be slightly different, right? But you should be able to find somewhat of a chart like this in your state, right? So you're looking at the percentage of the students times that multiplier for points that you're going to receive for that achievement level, right? And you're going to get those points received. So like, look at the highest achievement levels, right? Advanced plus, advanced, right? Not everybody's scoring at these levels, right? In a lot of schools, it's going to be very rare that kids get advanced ever. But in some schools, it's going to be common. Like everybody's going to get advanced, right? And so, those are everybody who's scoring up here all the time for a lot of those like really high-end districts, right? In Ohio, it's 5-star districts, but in other states it might be different. Those really upper-end districts, right? They're going to get all the points, right? At a higher rate, right? So 1.2, 1.3, right? So those are big multipliers, right? And if you got kids scoring down here, they're not even getting their full points, right? So you got kids in limited, they're only getting 1/3, 30% of the points that you would get if you were proficient, right? So it really hurts you, right? If you got kids limited, ideally you'd want to bring them up to proficient, but if you got kids teeter-tottering, you might want to put some more resources and effort forth to get these kids who are teeter-tottering on limited and basic up to basic, right? Or if they're teeter-tottering on basic to proficient, try to get them up to proficient, right? So really, a lot of your target kids, and again, you want to target everybody, right? But really kids you really want to target for like enrichment or title services or extra tutoring or something that you can possibly do to provide any more services to these kids. You oftentimes want to do so for the kids who are most close to the next level, closest to the next level. Because they receive just a little bit more help or they do just slightly better, then maybe they can get to the next level and get a whole bunch more points. Whereas if, let's say you're at, proficient, right? And, you're at the bottom of proficient, right? So you just hit proficient, right? It's like, yeah, you still want to focus on you so they don't revert back, right? But hopefully with review and right before the state test in general, hopefully they stick with proficient, right? But to get them all the way up to accomplished, well, now that's going to be a difficult task, right? And what's the point of doing that, right? You get a 0.1 extra multiplier, right, for accomplished, right? So why do that? Whereas if you had limited and you can get them up to basic, that's 0.3 that you're getting additionally. So, you got to take these things into consideration for your state test. Not everybody is going to state test. I no longer state test. I teach history. And so, maybe you don't need to even worry about something like this, right? But if you do, you should really understand how points are awarded for a state test, right? Because, look, if you don't even know how a test is scored, right, how are you going to teach to it? You don't know how the state test is scored. How can you teach to it, right? Is that, like, difficult to understand? I don't know. I think that makes a lot of sense to me. And personally, if I was a teacher, this is what I would be looking at, right? Because you got to understand it. And so, anyways, I am a teacher. And so I do understand this. And I've looked into it. And it's very useful to understand. It just helps you out. Anyways, those are the performance index scores. May want to know them. You may not want to know them. But what can you do with them if you are any type of teacher, right? Even if you're a teacher who doesn't need them, right? What can you do with them? Well, you can track your progress over time in a nice figure here, right? And so one of the things that we were required to do here, and this is just a screenshot from our thing here, they were called scrimmages, right? So this little tests that you'd get every couple weeks or so, right? Really just these little benchmark tests, right? And they're pretty useful, right? So you're teaching a unit, and you try to encompass as much as you can into 6 questions. So 4 multiple choice, 2 extended response, right? Extended response are worth 4 points each, and the multiple choice are worth 1 point each, right? So 12 points in total, right? And then you calculate the scores that they get, and it's going to rank them in a certain proficiency level, right? And then out will come these total performance index scores for the class as a result of putting the data into Excel. And so you can just calculate your performance over time, right? And like, why would this be useful, right? Why should you know how kids were performing for each unit, right? Or each different content standard or objective that you have in your class? Like, why is it important to know what the progress and trends are over time? Right now, maybe you could say, well, maybe you don't necessarily need to see a trend over time because these are different content units, right? Like if you're only covering one unit, yeah, you would expect to see a trend that was just going up, right? So, generally there will be some variation, right, in terms of like highs and lows and ups and downs, right? And again, validity and how you construct the test in general, is the test actually measuring what you want it to? Is it actually measuring understanding of the content standard that is relevant at hand, right? So you have to understand that first. Validity is huge, right? But assuming, and you're meeting the assumptions that all tests have the same validity, right? Then you can look at the graphs and you can look at the ups and downs. So ideally, you probably want to be over here on like number 11, right? Because that's the highest, right? So you want all tests to get up there, right? But if you're going back at the end of the year and you want to review content, where are you going to review at the end of the year, right? If you want to review the content, right? So you're looking at this graph and you're like, wow, I have to review, right? What standards did they understand the least? Because those are the ones that you want to cover first, right? The ones that they understand it perfectly, it's like those are the last ones that you want to cover. The ones that they understand it the least, those are the ones you want to cover the most, right? And the soonest, right? So right here on number 4, number 8, right? And then number 5, number 7, right? Number 14 is a little low, right? So just the ones at the bottom, you're trying to bring those up as much as you can, provide some more reinforcement, try to teach things a little bit differently. And that's just at the end of the unit, right? At the end of the year. What about at the, just lesson unit by unit, right? If you see, one unit, right? They scored all the way up there, right? And then the next unit, they're scoring right here. It's like maybe that's not a problem, right? But maybe you get another unit here, and then and it goes up a little bit. Okay, cool. So like maybe the baseline's like around here, right? You're gonna have some highs and lows. So not every unit's gonna be the absolute highest, right? But then maybe it goes back down here to scrimmage 4, right? And then maybe you want to, or quiz 4. So then maybe you want to teach that a little bit, right? Try to bring it up to 5, move it back up to 6, right? And so maybe you reteach it for another couple weeks, another few weeks, and you get an increase from here to here, right? So maybe it's just a harder unit in general, right? So you can see some increase, right? If you get low, you want to try to get high the next one, right? And so that will oftentimes just happen in general, right? Because you're constantly going back and reteaching things in accordance with the data. But you got to look at the data. It can really help to visualize things, right? Because look, you see something on the screen here. It's like, look, you see the first one here, quiz 1, 80, let's say 79 points, right? And then you look at quiz 2, 59 points. Like that doesn't sound like much of a difference. 20 points, it's like ooh, big deal, right? But when you really visualize it, you can see the big step downwards, and then you can compare everything, right? In terms of like you're just looking at it. It's less abstract in some regards, right? It's more visual. With these figures, that might make you help you make more reasonable decisions or evidence-based decisions moving forward. And so you can understand these comparatively. So just make little charts, use data, and it should help you out. All right, so lastly, we're going to provide grades and feedback to students, right? So again, what were we doing? So if you gather data, what now? You're going to provide grades and feedback. Feedback to students, right? Extremely important, right? Not everybody is always providing feedback, and that's something that a lot of teachers need to work on because, quite frankly, you're not going to be improving if you don't have the proper feedback. It's like, look, you studied really hard. You got a C, right? What now? What does that C mean? Right? You got 70%. Okay, I see I got this question wrong, this one right, this one wrong, this one right. It's like, but why did I get it wrong though? I just studied for 6 hours and I got it wrong. What does that mean? Well, the student doesn't know, right? So you have to tell them. You have to tell them with feedback. Okay, like that's not a difficult concept, right? And so look, if they're doing things grammatically wrong, you tell them, hey, look, you forgot your periods, you forgot your commas, you didn't capitalize pronouns, so you hit them on the grammar, right? And then you get to the actual content. It's like, well, look, you forgot to answer one part of the question, so you provide it. You told me what the term was. I don't know. You told me what a Roman amphitheater was, right? But then you only provided one example instead of 2, right? So right there's some feedback, right? So they're like, oh, I forgot an example, right? Or it could even be more complex. It's like, you just don't know what a Roman amphitheater is at all, right? And you tell them, right? So like think back to the Colosseum videos that we watch or something, right? Or the Colosseum project, right? It's like a big stadium, right? And so, you're just really guiding kids along with this. And again, there's no one right or wrong answer to this. Like with most things in education, right? There are differences from teachers that you can do. And it's like you're not going to provide feedback on every question. That would take too much time. But in an ideal world, you would. And so you want to provide as much feedback as that's possible, And so you have to figure out how to balance your time to do that. And you also have to figure out what kind of work-life balance you want. Because if you're taking work home all the time, in an attempt to provide feedback on every question all the time, right, in very detailed fashion, it's like, maybe you're one of those people who likes that, and you can do that and not suffer from mental health issues. But a lot of people, if they have to grade a 50-question test, like, they're not going to provide feedback on 45 multiple choice questions and 5 extended response or whatever it is, right? And so like, that's just not, you can't really do that most of the time, right? And so do take that into consideration. And another thing we'll talk about here is timeliness too. If it's going to take you forever to do that, or you can suffer and work 16 hours a day every day for like 5 days to get those tests back, it's like, those are trade-offs, right? But well, we'll talk about that a little bit. So provide grades and feedback to student. It's extremely important. But what is effective grading in general, right? So what is effective grading in general? The less abstract, the better. And so right here, you can provide students with these little charts here. And look, there's these things called, if you remember from the first lecture here, LMS, Learning Management Systems. These are going to be your Canvases, your Blackboards, your Google Classroom, your PowerSchool, your, what is it called, Home Access, right? You're going to have softwares, these programs that can help you grade, right? And they can provide the students with those grades that they can access at any time online. Now, most of these softwares don't have any room for you to assess data like this, right? Oftentimes, you're going to have to make these charts in Excel or some other software that you find or program that you find online, right? So the less abstract, the better, right? So if you want your students to actually visualize their performance over time, and in comparison to the class average, you're going to have a little bit of work ahead of you, right? And you can do that easily in an Excel spreadsheet, right? One of the things that you could do is you just quickly, you could put the test number down, right? So test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? And then you can go by each student, right? So you get student 1, Jose, and then you get, I don't know, Jimmy, and then you get Timmy, then you get Alani, and then you get a whole bunch of student names, right? So any student that's in your class, right? And so you get the test number, and then you get all the student names, right, in the first column, right? In the first row, right? And then below you do test number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then you put their scores per student for each test number, right? And then you just highlight that data in Excel, and you make what's called, well, we can show you here. It'll just be a lot easier. So I believe I even got some here as well. If I can find it. I just made one. So maybe we can find it, even show you guys. Grading figure example here, right? So this is what I just made here. All right, so now let's say you got test number, you get the class average, and then you got student name, right? All you do is you just highlight it, right? And then you go to the data tab here, right, up top. And then you're going to go to, or no, you're not going to go to the data tab. You're going to go to the insert tab, right? And you just go right here. You're going to click on this like little chart, this little bar graph chart. You just do like a clustered column, for example, right? And then when you click on the clustered column, right, not everything's going to pop up right away. So you can see you got test number on the bottom. Well, the test number has to be on the side, right, or on the bottom itself, right? So like, when I mean the bottom, I mean like right down here on the x-axis, right? And so one thing that you could do instead would be to just click on the data, like right there, and then you just right-click, right, and then you just hit select data, I believe, and then you could just click off of test number, right? And so that way it's not displaying on the x-axis, and then boom, you got your little graph, right? So it's very easy to make these things, right? But you will have to type in the scores by hand. And so, really only do these for tests or quizzes or something that you're using as a benchmark to sort of gauge your performance over time, as well as comparatively for students, right? And so then maybe you just want to print them off a chart for their own performance each time. You don't necessarily have to, but you can, or you can just show them where they're going to be at in terms of performance, well, in comparison to everybody. And so you just have them come up to your desk. That way it's a little bit more private, block out the other student names, and that's certainly something that you can do. And so how would you do that, right? You can just put like a box. You can insert like a text box, fill it in black, right, over all the names, and so that way you can just point them to what bar is theirs, right? So if their bar is here, then you just show them, it's like, hey, this is your score, this is everybody else, this is the class average, right? Now you know your score, right? And so it doesn't have to be that difficult, right? But you will have to slot out time to do this, right? So it's not like it's just coming easily overnight here. But it is relatively easy to do, especially once you figure everything out and you get more familiarized with Excel. And easy, basic though, right? You're not doing all these complicated, complex things, and you shouldn't have to, right? But you should know how to use some of these programs. So anyways, the less abstract, the better. Students can visualize things. Again, you're looking at it, it's like, what does the number mean, right? But when you're looking at it in terms of this, it's like, whoa, dude, it's like Jose killed it, right? He did way better than the class average, right? So, but then you look over here, it's like, he did worse, or no, he did worse than the class average right over here, right? So then he's got to step it up next time, right? You can recognize that a little easier. And so, well, it's less abstract, right? Less just numerical in the head. You can just sort of visualize it a little bit easier. All right, so next up here we got rubrics slash objectivity. That's going to be another important thing for effective grading. We talked about rubrics a little bit. You want things that are more objective in nature, more quantifiable, and rubrics are great at that, right? So I got a number of different rubric examples that I can pull up for you guys. We can show what a rubric really looks like, and we'll do that here in a second, right? But what is the importance of a rubric? Like, why would anybody want to make a rubric, right? Because they are time-consuming to make, and sometimes you can make rubrics that work for a whole bunch of different assignments, right? So they're really not that time-consuming, but they can be very time-consuming to make, especially when starting out. But what's the nice thing about them? Well, they're objective, right? If you do this, right, you get this grade. If you do that, you get that grade, right? It tells you, right? It's upfront, right? It's very transparent in terms of grading, right? It's going to tell students, hey, look, you do this, you get that, right? But if you don't do that, then you're going to get this, right? And so, it's very objective in some regards, right? There's less room for subjectivity that's involved, right? Because if I'm a teacher and I don't have a rubric, right, and something's graded out of, say, 4 points, it's like, what differentiates it 3 points from 4 points, right? It's in my head, it's like maybe I'm gauging it, right? And maybe it's still subjective, right? But if you have something that's more objective, like a rubric, right, they're going to know exactly what they need, and it doesn't seem biased, right? So you're really just protecting yourself with a rubric, right? You want to make sure that you are, being fair to everybody. You're grading in an equitable manner, that everybody has the same chance to be graded in the same manner to get the same scores. And yeah, because maybe you like one student, right, and you're not even thinking about it, right? It's just like unconscious, right? Unconscious bias, right? And which you can't train out of people, by the way. It's actually pretty interesting research. I believe it was from Harvard's Michaela Carlana, if I remember correctly. He was doing this research. Anyways, if you have a bias towards a student, right, and maybe you don't even know about it, right, this unconscious bias, and how is that going to impact the student's grades, right? Your bias towards them. What if you're biased in their favor, though, right? How is that going to impact the grades positively? And so ideally, you want to have a rubric just to protect yourself from being biased, right? Look, if somebody doesn't do X, Y, or Z, they're not going to get X, Y, or Z's points, right? And so rubrics, they help you out. They make you more objective, less biased, and they should be used. So what does a good example of a rubric look like? Well, one thing I'll say is there's lots of different types of rubrics, right? So one rubric that I really love is oral presentation rubric. So we'll look at this here. I made this one. It's one of my favorite rubrics that I use. This is for just, you got an assignment, you got a project, right, and you want students to present or effectively communicate their information to other students in the class, right? And, again, rubrics, they're not perfect, right? I feel like you can never just gauge in its totality whatever you're measuring with the rubric perfectly, right? There's going to be some room for error, something that doesn't necessarily get assessed perfectly. But rubrics, they help out with this process. So you got an oral presentation rubric. What does the 0 look like? NS. What does NS mean? Look up here, right? No submission, right? If you got no submission, you get 0 points, right? So you didn't do it, you automatically get a 0, right? But then we'll go on to other category. So we'll go on to the next score category, limited, right? If you're limited in terms of your ability, your display is unorganized and missing over half of the information, right? Organization, right? Presents facts in a random order and is difficult for the audience to understand, right? Eye contact / focus. Eyes are focused only on the present, eyes, there's a typo there. Can you believe that? Eyes are focused only on the presentation and or they are extremely distracted, pausing / stopping their presentation. Voice is extremely quiet to where the audience cannot understand the presenter and or is often mumbled. Right, so that's limited, right? You're not where you're supposed to be. You need to step things up a lot to get to proficient, right? Because that's where you should be at least proficient, right? But then what does excellent look like though? What is like the most amount of points that you can get in comparison? So display is organized and is not missing any crucial elements. Presents facts in a manner that is presents facts in an orderly manner that is easy for the audience to understand. Eye contact was made with the audience throughout the presentation, and the presenter did not get distracted. Voice is loud enough for all audience members to focus on the presenter, and there is no mumbling. Right? So again, there is subjectivity in these rubrics. Right? They're not going to be completely objective. You're not going to be able to assess everything, but it just makes things a little bit easier, and people know what distinctions would be, right? So look, you could say, what is the distinction between normal and loud in terms of voice, right? Well, normal is just like talking level, right? So if I'm sitting here, I'm not projecting my voice right now. I just got a little bit quiet, right? Because I'm just talking, right? But if I start to project myself like I have been for the entire lecture, then that would be projection. So that's the distinction between like a 3 and a 4. Now you could say, what if you're like right in the middle, right? So you're kind of projecting yourself, but you're not fully projecting yourself. Well, then maybe you have to look at some other aspects of the thing as well. So the audience understands and or there's little mumbling. It's loud enough for all the members to focus on the presenter and there's no mumbling. So you're gauging a little bit more than just one aspect, right? So maybe that helps out a little bit. But there will be some subjectivity in this, right? And you're not going to eliminate it completely, right? But at least you can make it more objective than it otherwise would have been. And so, oral presentation rubric, that's a fun one. I also got another one here too. This one was pretty cool. So I just made this one recently. It's actually an effort rubric, right? And so, one of the things with effort rubrics is sometimes a lot of teachers will grade on participation or, effective behavior in class, or I guess pro-social behavior in class is what you would consider it. And, there's benefits to doing that. There's negatives to doing this. One of the benefits of effort rubrics is that it creates what's called self-efficacy. So shout out to our guy Bandura, right? He is that one researcher focusing on self-efficacy, I believe. Right? Maybe I got that wrong. No, that's Bandura, I believe. And what is self-efficacy? You're creating a sense of self-worth. Your ability to believe that you can do something is being heightened. And so, look, if you got an effort rubric, you'd be more motivated if you're doing well, at least in some category, than you would be if you were doing terrible across all categories, right? So you're just giving them some points, just giving them some points to make them, I guess, just happy, more motivated to move forward, right? Because if you get a 0 on everything, right, you're going to have no motivation, right? But if every once in a while you get a bone thrown at you, you might be a little bit more inclined to try in some of the more immediate future lessons, right? So there's positives and negatives to effort rubrics, but look, you can use them, you can't use them. It really depends. That you can use them, not use them. It depends on your teaching style, what you want to do. I don't really use effort rubrics that much, but I made one recently, and I think it's pretty good, right? So you look at like engagement, right? No effort in any capacity, right? So there's sleeping, right? Limited, maintained engagement with the task between 1 and 25% of the time. Basic, maintain engagement with the task between 26 and 50% of the time. Proficient, maintain engagement with the task 51 to 75% of the time. Excellent, maintain engagement with the task between 76 and 100% of the time. Then you got upholding of expectations, right? So your classroom rules, right? Expectations, 10 plus violations, 0. 9 to 10 violations, 0.5. Basic, 6 to 8 violations. Proficient, 4 to 5 violations. Excellent, 0 to 3 violations. And these things are subjectively, you could totally alter them, right? Be like, all right, excellent is 0 to 1 violations. Proficient, 2 to 3 violations. Basic, 4 to 7 violations, right? And so you just keep going down the list here, but again, it's subjective based on what you want to see as a teacher, right? But these are just rubrics, right? You're trying as hard as you can to quantify something, right? And make it as objective as possible, 1 to 25% of the time. Now, how would you measure that, right? So you maybe walk around with a little clipboard, you got student names on it, you're just giving them tally marks whenever they're not focusing, right? And you're going to keep an eye on them, right? So you're sort of eyeballing in some regards for this, percentage, right? But so it'll be a little bit subjective, right? But then you got violations, right? You see kid violate the rule, check. And that's very objective, right? So you see kids out of their seat, check. right? You see kids swearing, check, right? You see kids throwing something, check, right? And so, look, expectations, easily able to do that one. So, effort rubric, pretty cool. Rubrics are just cool in general. So, so there we go. So rubrics touch objectivity. Now, next up here, we got includes feedback. Now, this is extremely important, right? You always want to be including feedback all the time. Like we talked about, kids need to know what they did wrong, right? And so you have a kid, and they just scored a D on their assignment, right? And they studied really hard for it. We've all been there before. You study really hard for something, and for some reason you bomb it because maybe you weren't studying right. You studied the wrong information. I don't know, you weren't focused as much. You didn't get good sleep. Something. There's a million different reasons why, and it's probably a collection of things as it is for everything. And you get the grade back. You see this D. You see 60%. You just see an X. It's like, okay, I know I got it wrong, right? And maybe I have enough knowledge to understand why I got it wrong, but in a lot of cases, students don't, right? And so it's better to just provide feedback in the anticipation that they don't understand where they went wrong, so that we can sort of guide them to know. It's like, look, you did this wrong. Here's what you should have done, and hopefully you can improve upon it moving forward. Whereas if they have no idea, that's not beneficial to them. They just know, well, I got it wrong. It's like, I don't know why I got it wrong, I just got it wrong. Like, how is that helpful to the student, right? So you want to provide feedback, right? And that way they can improve moving forward. And they can build on their understanding. And feedback is particularly important in for certain subjects as opposed to others, right? Like if I get, let's take history, for example, right? It's less important, right? Because history doesn't necessarily always build on to other topics in history, right? So like if I'm talking about like, I don't know, the Mayans, how does the Mayans relate to Oliver Cromwell? Or like, you know what I mean? Like there's just, it's not, there's like, I'm sure everybody can make connections to everything, right? We're all everything's interrelated, right? But look, there's very little connection to, certain topics. And so it's not building on. Whereas if you had math, for example, like if you don't know how to add and you don't know how to, do basic multiplication, it's like how on earth are you going to do algebra? It's like you can't do algebra because you don't have a basic foundation, right? So feedback is extremely important, especially in subjects that build on from one another. And so you always got to take that into consideration. Like if you're a math teacher, you should be providing feedback all the time. English is the same. And there'll be some interdisciplinary work as well, right? So like you're writing an essay in history, you're still going to want to grade them in grammar just like it's in English class. And so do take that into consideration. So includes feedback, very, very, very important, right? That's going to be one of the big things you're going to hear in interviews. It's like if you're not mentioning feedback and how you give it to students, you've lost the battle, right? And so effective grading really is not necessarily just in terms of rank ordering students. And like we've moved away from like ranking students on grading for the past like, I don't know, like at least 20 years, 20, 30 years now. And so don't think that that's the primary motivation to grade students. The reason you grade students is so that, one, you can gauge their level of understanding, you can use that data to inform your instruction moving forward, and you can also provide feedback to tell them where they went wrong and how they can improve moving forward, right? So it's a collaborative effort between you and the student, right, and other stakeholders as well that you will engage into the fold, and we'll talk about that probably in the next lecture. But look, if there's no feedback, right, there's no improvement, right? Or there's very limited improvement. But if there is feedback, there's the chance that you can get a lot more improvement. All right, anyways, discuss the students' positive and negatives, right? So one of the funny things here is I was watching this lecture, and I believe it was Jordan Peterson. And again, I don't necessarily agree with him on politics, right? But I do agree with him on his psychology courses, which are really awesome to look at, right? So not a fan of the politics, fan of the psychology lectures, right? And so anyways, he was talking about grading student essays, right? And it's like, well, how do you grade effectively? And this is funny because he's not, I mean, he is a teacher, right? But like he's not necessarily a teacher like in my capacity, right? Where he's just focusing solely on education. That's just what he does. He's a psychologist who also happens to teach. And so what did he say about grading essays? Well, it's like, look, you get a bad essay, right? It's like kids did this wrong, that wrong, that wrong, that wrong, that wrong, that wrong, that wrong, right? It's like you got poor essay structure, right? You didn't indent, you forgot your periods, you forgot your commas, right? Everything's wrong, spelled wrong, spelled wrong. You're not using you're not capitalizing pronouns, and then you only made it like half the length that it was supposed to be, and you forgot to do bold your subheadings, and you did your references wrong in APA format. It's like everything is wrong, okay? It's like there's nothing that you did was right almost in some regards, right? But I'm sure you can find something that they did that you can say, hey, look, it's like at least you got your periods right, or at least you indented right, and well, but you did this, this, and this, and this, and this wrong, right? So you tell them where they're going wrong, but you also provide them some positives, right? Things that you like to see from them, and hopefully that it just tells them that, look, I'm not a complete mess up. Hey, I can do things right, and there's evidence of that, right? But if you don't point that out to the student, they'll think, well, what's the point of trying? I just did everything wrong. There's no hope for me. It's like, no, it's like there's hope for you because you did this, this, and this right, right? But you may have gotten that, and that wrong. And so there's a lot of room for improvement, but you can achieve at a higher level than you're at currently. But then also the negatives, right? So don't just focus on the positives. Obviously, the negatives is probably the most important, right? Because they got to know where they went wrong, so that way they can improve it, right? But the positive is also important too, so you're providing some of that incentive for them to achieve moving forward. And they know too, positive is just as important as negatives, right? In the sense that if they know they did something right, they don't got to worry about if it was wrong, right? So that's very important. Next up, timeliness. Timeliness, very, very important. Everything's important, right? God, I sound like I'm like Donald Trump or something. I just keep saying very, very, it's huge, it's amazing, right? But no, it is very important to have timeliness when you're grading. So as soon as possible. Like don't have a project, right, or a worksheet or something that you have students hand in and then give it back to them 2 months later, right? Now, you could do it maybe if you cover it in class and so you tell them what the answers were to that, right? And maybe they can know where they went wrong based on your classroom review. But it's best if you can provide their own unique grade to them right away. And so do it as soon as possible. There's really not much else to say there because they're going to forget about a lot of things, right? If you had something that you hand back 2 months later, they don't even remember 2 weeks ago sometimes, right? So you want to make sure they're remembering 2 months. 2 months ago is like whole other year. And so do take that into consideration. It's hard, because if you're a teacher, you're going to have a lot of assignments coming back at you. And if you're trying to grade everything as fast as you possibly can, it can get stressful, right? Because you got a million other things to do. Like when you're a teacher, like it's like, God, I mean, teaching is just nothing compared to what you actually have to do, right? You got to stay on top of IEP accommodations, 504 accommodations. You got to obviously grade, right? You got to upload assignments to your learning management system. You got to actually be planning assignments. You got to be planning ahead, creating these good lesson plans. And not necessarily formally, but informally, it still takes time, right? You got to be doing researching the topics so you know exactly what to talk about. You got to be looking at the student data, know how to tailor your instruction on a day-to-day basis or a week-to-week basis. You got to be collaborating with your peers, focusing on the disciplinary matters in the classroom, right, and how you can remediate that, calling parents and other stakeholders, and tracking those interactions back and forth, emailing with your administration, doing administrative work. I mean, there's just no shortage of things that you have to do when you're a teacher, and when you're when you got to focus on grading, that just adds another hat that you got to put on, and well, it can be difficult at times, and so just try to be cognizant. When I was a student teacher, my teacher mentor, she forced me to grade like the second something came in, and it was super annoying, but it was a good habit to get into, right? Because if you grade things faster, it's just better all around for everybody, and you have less stress in moving forward. And it's like kind of like the same thing with procrastination in some regards that everybody's guilty of. I'm extremely guilty of procrastination, but I'm also learned to live with it in some regards. I have a very rigid routine that I abide by 100%. Like, for example, every single Sunday, I only do grad school. Every single Thursday, I only do grad school, right? On any spare moment of free time, right? I don't do anything else. Nothing else, right? But if you can't have the self-discipline to do something like that, it's going to get very difficult for you. And you could put grading off to the last minute, but just try not to, right? Just try to have a little bit more discipline up front. It really helps out. So that way you got a little buffer, something could go wrong, system doesn't work, something, it's just, I don't know, you get hit by a bus, I don't know, right? But you gotta take that into consideration. Next up, at the student's level, so don't provide them feedback in the most graduate level terminology, right? You want to provide them feedback, something that's so far above their heads that they're never going to understand it. Look, if you got a third grader, provide feedback to them at a third grade level. If you got or maybe even lower, right? So they try to understand it. Just try your absolute hardest to get them to understand. Pictures could be some little diagrams, or just do it for them if it's math, for example, right? Just do the problem out by hand, right? And again, look, I get it, right? That's very time consuming. You're not going to always do that, and I understand that. But that would be, if you wanted to see the most amount of improvement, that's something that you would do, right? So you're not doing it all the time, and I wouldn't expect anybody to do that all the time. But you do it on certain problems. You just work them through, see, this is where you went wrong, right? And then you should have continued where you were. So at student's level, and then so yeah, but if they're at a 12th grade level, then obviously you can be a little bit more advanced in your talking or in your writing. Next up, frequent feedback all the time. You always want to be providing feedback. Never stray away from it. Grading should be all the time, right? You just want to, if you're covering something, no more than the general rule of thumb is no more than a week or two, right? So don't try to make grades extend out very far. Within 2 weeks, usually, definitely by 2 weeks, usually 1 week, you should really get your grading done. Get your grading done, I mean. And then lastly, reflective/plans forward. This is the last talking point here. Here we go. Reflective/plans forward. Okay, PDF. We're not going to work today. All right, reflective/plans forward. Why would students need to be reflective? Right, again, it's another question that we're posing to you, the audience. Right? Why do students need to be reflective? So they're taking some sense of responsibility for their performance. Right? They're saying, look, I got a D. Right? What does that mean to me? Right? Why did I get a D? Right? And it forces them to be reflective. Right? So you could even have an assignment on this, and I would recommend that. In a lot of cases, the teachers have assignments on just a reflection about their performance. Why did I get an A? It's important to understand why you did good just as much as it is why you did bad. Right? Why did you get an A? Right? Well, you studied 3 hours one night, 4 hours the next night, and then you studied your notes in the morning. You had a good breakfast, you had good sleep, right? You have less stress in your life right now. There's no drama going on. Maybe that's why I got an A. Right? Where if you got a D, you say, okay, well, I have some drama going on. I didn't study for more than 1 hour, and I didn't eat breakfast that day, and I got no sleep too because I was up late playing video games. It's like, well, then it sort of forces you to examine your life and be like, wow, look, if I actually wanted to get a good grade, it's like, could I have spared the video game time? And look, that's going to take some sense of responsibility on their behalf, right? So you can't always force everybody to necessarily see that, the fact that they might be the problem, right? But a lot of people with sense will recognize that right away. It's like, I could have done better. I know I should be doing better. And that's going to be the majority of people. You can get them to understand that. But it's not always the case, right? So that's reflection. Then plans forward. So not only should you be saying, well, why did you get the grade that you received, right? What does it really mean? So you really got to sit back and reflect, right? And if you're sitting back and reflect, and you really reflect, right? It's going to come back, and you're going to know what you need to do, right? And knowing what you need to do can help you make a plan forward, right? So you sit back and say, wow, look, I probably was playing too much video games. I could have spent 3 hours studying. I could have. I didn't want to, but I know it would be good for me. And, well, next time I'll study an hour a day for 3 days. And that will get me to where I need to be. Right? And, but you got to hold yourself accountable to that. I can't hold you accountable for that. You have to hold yourself accountable. So there's that. Well, that's the lecture. I think this was a very interesting lecture, especially at the end there, because effective grading, it is very important. You got to be mentioning data all the time. When you go into an interview, always mention data. It's one of those big talking points, one of those big buzzwords, and this is why it is a lecture, right? Again, I don't give lectures for things that are useless. I give lectures for things that actually are going to help you get a job or be the best practitioner in your field. And so data-driven instruction, I talk about that all the time. Make sure you recognize the differences between formative and summative assessment. And then what does it mean to effectively grade, right, and provide that feedback. And so data-driven instruction, assessment, and grading, that is the lecture today, guys. Timestamps will be in the description below. If you do want to refer back to anything, any part, please leave some comments and about questions that you might have. I'll be sure to answer them. If you want to follow me on social media, it will be at Ian Phillips USA. Links will be in the description below. APA citation will be in the description below. And well, that's pretty much it. Now it's a clear run to the grave. We got probably about 3 more lectures left. I'm thinking we're going to do one on technology. We're going to do one on stakeholder engagement. We're going to do one on student teaching in the job market, current state of affairs. You know what, it just escaped me. We actually have another one as well. We got one on famous case studies too. So maybe that's 4 lectures. But we might have more, we might have less, but I'm thinking 4 more left. Again, maybe we add another one, maybe we don't. But case studies and special education law. So very important that you understand, very important that you understand the law when it comes to special education, right? It's one of those things that can just, God, it can kill you right away. It's actually the most litigious area in all of education. So anyways, that's a tangent. We'll end the lecture here. Thank you very much for watching. I am your professor, Ian Phillips, and well, thank you.